I said earlier in another video I wanted to really nail a point home about Eretz. And let me just make an airtight point here. In verse 12, God says, "A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth," in the Eretz, Eretz, Eden, the region of Eden. That is how Eretz is used. That should be the default definition we use in the narrative here. It's a regional location. How do I know? Well, if Cain is to be a fugitive and a vagabond in the Eretz, then what does he do, though? He leaves the Eretz Eden and goes to Eretz Nod. Cain was a fugitive and a vagabond in the land of Eden, but built a city and thrived once he departed Eden for the land of Nod. So we can tell.
I think I finally start to see what you're saying, where we have talked about this before rather extensively, but I see where, with what you just said, I liked how you explained that, because it just seems you can clearly see that he's unsuccessful in this particular land, but then goes somewhere else and is fine. He succeeds. He
Right.
thrives.
Once he leaves Eretz Eden and goes to Eretz Nod, he does build a city and thrives. So, in verse 12, "A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be on planet Earth." That's how some people read it. That can't be right.
Then how can he succeed? Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. No, that is definitely how most people. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense where he's a fugitive and a vagabond. He'll be on the entire planet Earth. So Cain goes to the land of Mars to build a city, I guess. Just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you have here in verse 16, "And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod," Eretz Nod, on the east of Eden. "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch." So he builds a city and thrives in Eretz Nod because it's not Eretz Eden. All right.
That was good, man. That did make a lot more sense. However you worded that was really good.
Cool.
Like, I knew we talked about before, but I just finally clicked with whatever you just said.
Yeah, we've been right there kind of talking on it a couple times, but I haven't really it's a powerful point we have here, that Cain left Eretz, what? Eretz Eden, People that reading this portion, the narrative, I'll put the picture on the screen, the two green sections, the narrative sections. Whenever you see earth, Eretz, make sure it's the Hebrew Eretz. It means the land of Eden and not planet Earth. And there's absolute proof of that in Genesis 4:16. Land of Nod. Cain thrived. That's the proof. This is so important. You realize Eden is a region. You realize that
It's clearly that not only does it not make sense, but it's contradictory. While Cain will be again, a vagabond and a fugitive, which means like he would wander. He could not settle. So how can he wander but then settle? So it's clearly a contradiction.
Yeah. Yep. Eretz Eden.
There it is.
Eretz Eden is roughly synonymous with Eretz Canaan and Eretz Israel. And that's the truth.
I thought this guy really seems crazy, but a lot of what he's telling.
Well, from here it gets into a genealogy, and I don't, I mentioned to you before that I don't know if a genealogy has been incorporated at this point, but it doesn't seem like it. It just seems to read pretty naturally. So it could be that Moses included just kind of flowed into Cain's genealogy at this point. But there's something important to notice here. So Cain has a son, Enoch. And then you go through this genealogy and you arrive at a Lamech in this line. And Lamech is a guy that did something really crazy that I'll get into here. And but something that's important to notice here is that in Cain's genealogy, there's an Enoch and a Lamech. And that's going to be real important when we look at chapter 5 in Seth's genealogy, because there's an Enoch and a Lamech. And this is important. And a lot of people don't know about it, but this is important. And if you can figure out what's going on here, you can figure out what happened to Enoch.
Right.
We talked about Cain leaving the land and going to the land of Nod. Left his homeland and went to the land of Nod. And you and I have talked some on the genealogy there. And the names here, if you compare them to the names on my chart, when you look on my chart, you see that Cain's descendants are
Enoch.
That means dedicated. Then
Irad.
That means wild ass. Then
Mehujael.
blot thee out that Yah is God.
Methusael.
They died inquiring,
Lamech.
which means for humiliation. But if you look at Seth's line,
Seth.
means appointed. Then
Enos.
mortal man,
Cainan.
their smith,
Mahalaleel.
praise of God,
Jared.
descent,
Enoch.
dedicated,
Methuselah.
they died. And it goes on from there. There's sort of a weird turn on the names that stem from Cain, or I guess the names that are in Seth's line too, that we get in chapter 5. What it is that I think if you could somehow understand the reason for the names of the different Edenic people, you would understand some of the things that were going on in Eden during the time frame. And then in Cain's line, this represents a line that sort of turns toward evil, and the names in the line become turns on names in the Sethite line, like you have Mahilalel in the Sethite line, and then in Cain's line you have Mehujael, and likewise in the Sethite line, you have Methuselah, and in the Cainite line, you have Methusiel. And so in the Cainite line, though, what it is that these names seem to be turns on some of the Sethite names to show that his descendants drifted into wickedness, I suppose. So I think the names in Cain's line, I think there's turns on them to show his line drifted into wickedness. But in the Sethite line, if you could understand the reason each of those men has the name they have, I think you could understand some things that happened in Eden. And an example of that is Jared. His name means descent, and it's in his days that the event in Genesis 6, 1-4 happened. The sons of God came down. They descended. That's why his name is Descent. So it was during his life that episode happened. The sons of God came down. And then in Cain's line, you see that there's an interesting thing here. At the very end, the name of a girl is given, the name of a woman.
Naam.
And it means pleasantness and loveliness. And it's funny because some old Jewish tradition thinks that Naamah was Noah's wife. I think Rabbi Eliezer said that, or somebody. But there's a reason, I think, more seriously, there's a reason this name of this lady is given in the Canaanite genealogy. And it's because, and her name meaning pleasantness, loveliness, agreeableness, she was one of the women that the sons of God took as a wife and beget Nephilim. And so, Lane, here's something to think about. When you understand the imputation of the first priest correctly, and you understand that there were no fallen angels in the time of the Garden of Eden, that the first fallen angels there were was Genesis 6, that Naamah was one of the ladies that was involved, then that means the fall of the angels happened in 3520 BC. How about that?
Pretty cool, man. So you think that this lady was connected with the Nephilim, giving us a date on when the angels actually fell?
Yeah. And what I did is I had Cain having offspring at roughly the rate given in the Sethite genealogy. They're both Edenic. They both have this longevity. And again, it's only the descendants of Adam that had this longevity. It's like Abraham's wife, even in her older age, she was still attractive to men and stuff. And so I basically patterned Cain's descendants after the Sethite genealogy, having roughly the same. And so, it's just a guess, but I have the fall of the angels in 3520 BC. Now, there's no other theology out there that can explain the fall of the angels, why it happened, and when it happened. Only this theology explains it.
Especially when I suppose that other theologies might have a guess, but not a very good guess like this one does. Or good reason, I should say, to explain why did the angels fall.
Yeah, why did the angels fall? I talked about it just a little in that video, My Theology. And I'll link that in the video. But when you realize in the garden what you have is a serpent and a divine omen for a purpose, the fall was intended. The two Adam scheme was intended from the very start of all things as we know it. And it wasn't until Genesis 6 that the angels fell. And that is according to the Bible, when you really look at it.
I'll tell you what, man, that divine omen of the serpent is quite different than what you take from tradition. You know, most take it as Satan, and he is the origin of evil and causes Adam and Eve to sin when it really should have been a perfect creation, or that's what's supposed. But this is very different to think that this was an actual divine omen to get things started. Someone might think that's kind of cruel, maybe, or God wanted this to happen or something. But I think people don't really understand the bigger picture of what God's trying to do here. When they have that perspective.
Well, the origin of evil is in Adam's transgression.
Right.
God had it to be just like he had the cross of the second Adam to be. So, I don't know. But, yeah, it's deep stuff. So, yeah, I wanted to mention that maybe someone that can crack the code of the names can know more about what happened in Eden during this long span of time that's only covered in Genesis 5 because of, by way of a genealogy. So we don't know much. We know giants were in the land in those days, though. And wherever Cain was dwelling, giants were there. And giants were in other regions. And something I could bring up now, or as we're talking on the flood, I may as well bring it up whenever I think of it, but there's something to the existence of Nephilim that shows somewhat the footprint of the flood. And what it is that we know there were Nephilim in the land before the flood, but after the flood, in Moses' wilderness wanderings, and then in Joshua's conquest, we get more information about Nephilim. And we see that they are still in Edom and Bashan, or Bashan. And it seems that some had again began dwelling in Canaan. But let's see, how did the one scholar put it? But I have a page from his book here, and it says, after quoting a bunch of scripture references about giants, he says, from these notices, it would seem that the Rephaim were specially associated with the region east of Jordan, though traces of their former presence were also to be found here and there in Canaan as well. So what you had was giants in Edom, Bashan, and east of the Jordan River, and they had began to dwell once again in Canaan, but they had been wiped out of there by the flood. Because one of God's intents in the flood was to destroy Edenic Nephilim. Of course, he destroyed all the Edenic people except Noah and his descendants. But Edenic Nephilim, the giants in the land, were destroyed in the flood. All the Edenic people were, except 8, according to Peter. That's represented on the one, on chart number 2.
I'm still here. I'm just I guess that sound disappeared. I'm leaving my mic off until I have something to say, but I'm on your second chart here on the
Oh,
on
okay.
Bruno
Yeah.
page here, looking at it.
So those peach-colored areas are where the giants were. And see those pages from the scholar there to the right? That's the commentary on Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 2. Okay. If I look up Deuteronomy Critical Commentary Archive, it's driver that says this. Once I saw that, I remembered it. Well, goodness sake, what page was that? Oh, 37, okay. Let me make sure this is driver, and then I'll quote that again. That may as well talk about the giants here real quick, because we're getting into the flood, and this is one little indication of the footprint of the flood. Of course, it's bigger than I think the flood was.
I was just gonna say, looking at this chart, so did the flood just cover the green area there, killing the Edenic giants, or did it cover into some of these other lands where you had some giants roaming?
Well, it depends how you look at it. The largest footprint for the flood, I may as well say this. Well, we're starting to get into the flood, getting toward it. Okay, so chart number 2. The green, that's my theory of the land of Eden, marked out by Abraham's 4 altars. So it's Shechem north and Hebron south. I think it's roughly synonymous with Canaan and Israel, although those are larger. Canaan, you could say, begins with Sidon north, and that's where that number 34 is. and that's one of Canaan's sons, Sidon. Well, that's an ancient city, and that's the northern extremity of Canaan. And this is according to Genesis 10:19. And Israel then is smaller than Canaan by a bit. Eretz Israel never was as big as Eretz Canaan. And I think Eden was a little smaller still. That's just my opinion, though. I mean, maybe people would want to say Eretz Israel is synonymous with Eretz Eden, you know? So it could be. But depending how you look at that will impact the footprint of the flood. Because in Genesis, let's see. Anyway, when you look at the details in Genesis 6, 7, 8, it talks about the waters prevailing upon the land and the waters covering the land. So I guess the maximum footprint, looking at the chart, so the maximum footprint would have all the green area totally submerged, totally underwater.
For the waters were on the face of the whole earth.
But I think that would be to misunderstand the hyperbolic language in the flood story, which is just saying that the flood was extensive. You can't take the descriptions overly literally. You have to recognize hyperbole in Scripture, and you just really need to. You can show other examples where it's necessary. In Joshua's conquest, if you look into it, you'll find it's necessary because it'll mention how the Israelites wiped out a people, but then later those people still exist. And it means an overwhelming victory, but you can't take you just need to recognize the hyperbolic language that occurs at times. And it certainly occurs in the flood narrative. It's talking about the extent of the flood. So, the devastation of the flood. And I don't know, I'm just getting way off into the flood at this point. I don't know if I should or not. Well, that's the largest footprint for the flood. The smallest possible footprint would be that the flood wiped out essentially the region that was delegated to Sedek, that was later occupied by the Jebusites. Would have been a region that included Jerusalem, or Jebus, and that would be the smallest footprint. I think the flood was somewhere between the two. And, well, let me just pick some verses here from Genesis 7. In Genesis 7:17 it says,
And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, The ark went upon the face of the waters.
Now, this is probably the dovetailing together of two accounts here. I don't have my chart pulled up. In the flood narrative, two Mosaic accounts were dovetailed together to form one story, and it's very apparent. We'll get into that in another video, though. And so in verses 17 and 18, Noah is noticing that the craft he's in has freed from the ground it's on, and he's now freely moving on the surface of the water. See, he could feel the craft being lifted. And what that means is it was at least 15 cubits deep. And the reason is because the craft was 30 cubits high. And basic buoyancy would mean if the water's lifting the craft now off the ground, then it's at least 15 cubits high. And Noah knew this. And this is how, when the craft was freely moving. Here, I'll go on. Okay, and then verse 19.
And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered.
Now, what this means, Noah, I haven't gotten into Noah's window at all. Noah built his own little window in this ark, and he wasn't instructed to do that, but he did. And we'll have to make a video on that, the faith of Noah. But he had a way of looking to see what was going on outside. And what he saw was just water out to the horizon. And that's what's basically being described here. And it seems that he lived in a region that had mountains on the horizon. I don't think he lived that far from Jerusalem or the place where the garden was. I don't think he lived far from there. And he would have hired help out constructing his craft from people from the Dead Sea region for the reeds and bitumen that's involved in that, and we'll have to get into that. But when he looked out his window, all he saw was water to the horizon. That's what's being communicated to you in the story.
15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered.
And this is because, as far as Noah can tell, he's just freely floating. He's not rubbing on the bottom of anything, freely floating all around, and all he sees is water to the horizon. That's the more proper way of reading this story as compared with, Ken Ham's version. And I don't know, it goes on from there. We can tell from the amount of time, the waters receded rather quickly, and Arthur Custance showed research on this, where the decreasing water level, you can use different details in the stories here. You can tell when Noah runs aground. Then you can tell when dry land appears. That means the water goes down 15 cubits. You can measure the time involved, and you can see that the water going down is more consistent with the runoff from a regional flood or runoff rate. It's more consistent with that than, say, evaporation, or just however the floodwaters receded in a global flood. I suppose it could have been miraculously I don't know. But it's not an evaporation. A very swift runoff that occurs. So that's just a detail to know about when you read the story. I don't know how I got off on this. Oh, the footprint of the flood. But this flood story, you have to understand it's a supernatural flood. It would be a frustrating thing to explain for someone that wants just a very non-supernatural or materialist interpretation of it, and naturalist interpretation of it. I think it's very supernatural. In fact, I think the supernatural activity of the Axis Mundi began with the springing up of the supernatural waters of the Gihon Spring in Genesis 2.
But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground.
And I think the last supernatural waters to spring forth out of the Gihon were the waters of the great deep.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened.
That sprang forth at the flood. That's a detail that in the flood story that a lot of people don't understand. I was watching some video not too long ago where the guy referred to this as if these were like oceans under the sea that broke open in the deep ocean or something like that. And I was like, no, it means springs.
That would actually be pretty good to clarify, because that's the young Earth creation perspective, is that the mid-ocean ridges like burst forth and just tons of water came out and flooded the whole world. But to see that it really just means springs, that'd be a pretty big deal.
Yeah, that's all the ancient writers referring to. Genesis 7:11, it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. Now, the fountains of the great deep broken up, this means springs burst forth. I think it means the Gihon spring and possibly some other springs in the area. I don't know. I think it means the Gihon spring, though. But it means springs. It doesn't mean there were these oceans under ground that burst open. I could look up some kind of scholar that talks about this, or maybe link to a video. I'd have to think about it. Here's the idea, though, man. In the ancient world, okay, they saw springs. They saw water coming up out of a spring. They thought there was an ocean underneath the ground. In fact, they thought the whole earth, they looked at the earth as sort of a lily pad, and they thought that there was water under the earth, okay? And it would poke up through in certain places, and these were springs. So when it says the oceans, and they're not entirely wrong, there's water under the earth. But when it says the oceans of the great deep burst forth, what it's saying is that springs on the ground that you can see, like springs burst forth. That's what it's talking about. It's not anything out in the ocean, deep in the ocean, cracking open and extra water gushing out. I know that's how people picture it, but that's not what the ancient author was communicating. He's talking about springs bursting forth, gushing forth. And so what I was saying, though, is I think it was a very supernatural flood. It had to wipe clean the sacred area, which is actually on top of Mount Moriah, sitting just in the view, just at the footstool, I guess, of Mount Zion. And that area had to be wiped clean by the flood. That's a mountaintop. It says the mountains of the whole earth. Now, the word translated mountains, it just means hills, but we are talking pretty major mountains. And so somehow this flood affected just that region, though. Another thing to keep in mind when considering the footprint of the flood is that this flood affected Jerusalem, but not Jericho. And Jericho is not far from Jerusalem. So this was a focused judgment, this divine flood. Because the reason I say that, Professor John Bright of Union Theological Seminary wrote a paper on this issue. And what he says here is something very important to keep in mind, and perhaps a troubling evidence against my view, even. Okay. Has archaeology found traces of the flood? He says, for the excavations in Palestine and Syria, the answer is an unqualified no. In these two countries, some of the oldest towns in the world have been excavated. We now know that Jericho was founded near the beginning of the late Stone Age. While we cannot be certain of exact dates in such an early period, we can be sure that the town was first settled between 8000 and 5000 BC. Since that time, the city of Jericho has been in more or less continuous existence, and the ruins of the ancient occupations show no evidence whatever of a flood. In North Syria, the mound of Tel Ejadida, we do not know the ancient name of the city there, was first settled about 5000 or 6000 BC in all probability, yet its ruins and those of other towns in the same area show no evidence of a flood during the course of the subsequent 5000 years. He goes on to say, in Mesopotamia, however, the situation is different. The evidence from Ur between 1922 and 1934, Sir Leonard Woolley directed some 12 campaigns of excavation of the site of the ancient Ur of the Chaldees in southern Mesopotamia. And he goes on from there. I would say that this is a wrong direction to go, though. He starts looking in Mesopotamia, but that is a river delta region where annual flooding is a way of life. It'd be like the Nile Delta. You can't compare those types of regions to Palestine, which is where the flood was. But it didn't affect Jericho. Yeah, the other most ancient sites around Jerusalem, I need to look into that more and see what I find. But like, you have Megiddo, that's northwest of Jerusalem in the Jezreel Valley. And most all of the sites in Jerusalem only date back to 2500 BC and stuff, 2000 BC. See, the year I have the flood is 2435 BC. That is earlier than most all archaeological sites in Palestine.
Would that suggest then that Palestine was formed after the flood then?
No, it just no. That's true anywhere. That's true anywhere. These extremely ancient sites like Jericho are just kind of few. Jericho is the nearest one. See, a site that predates the flood but was undisturbed by the flood helps you to draw the footprint because the flood didn't affect it. This is true with Jericho. And if you look on Google Earth, you can see the distance involved from actually looking at Google Earth, you can get an idea of what the flood kind of would have looked like. Jerusalem would have been destroyed. And there was no city there, but at that time anyway. I think Jericho may be the only site within range that matters as being very ancient and undisturbed by a flood. And they know that when they say that, because digging down through the strata, they've really carefully looked at Jericho and they examined this with pottery and so forth. And of course, today they have C14 dating and everything. And so they know a lot about Jericho, and it's so old that it's just so old it goes back into hunter-gatherer times. It's like Göbekli Tepe. That's how old it is. And it was one of the oldest cities around. Damascus is also like that. It's very, very old. I forget how old it is exactly. I mean, as an official city.
I could be completely off here, but I thought you might have mentioned the date, 6,500 years? Maybe BC?
Yeah, it's something like that. It's
the other one you mentioned, something Tepe?
Göbekli Tepe,
Göbekli
yeah.
Tepe. What is that, roughly 10,000, maybe?
Yeah.
10,000 plus? Wow.
Have you ever looked into that place?
It's a familiar enough place where I'm pretty sure you've talked about it here before, but I've never really looked into it too much. But I just remember you mentioned Jerusalem was really old, Damascus was really old, and this other place was really old, but never really looked into that place too much.
Yeah, I've mentioned it. I haven't really talked about it. It's an amazing thing because what it is it's a religious temple. And we weren't really supposed to find a religious temple that old, according to, I don't know, popular theorizing. It was always thought that man was a hunter-gatherer people. And then agriculture and domestication of creatures, of animals, was occurring, and farming, and civilized life began, and towns developed, and cities developed. And then, with this way of life in place, then religious concepts developed, and towns started building a temple sort of thing or whatever. And I don't know, that's just not right. So, and Göbekli Tepe shows like a Neolithic, I don't know, they just don't know why people in that time would be building a megalithic temple. It just doesn't make any sense. So I don't know. I don't have all that much to say on Göbekli Tepe, though. I don't know what it was. It was some kind of structure from the Pre-Adamite world. What they were doing, I don't know. I don't know what they were doing, but on chart number 4, if you look at that one, if you have the Facebook there.
Chart 4, you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm there, actually. Funny you mention that.
Göbekli Tepe's the oldest one.
I see it there.
Then you have this Namta Playa that is like a star. It's an observatory circle. It's a stone circle. It's some kind of observatory. Then we have the Malta temples. Then the Anu ziggurat. Then finally Stonehenge. Okay. Stonehenge is another one of these.
Seems like you either got these ziggurats or these circular structures of some sort.
Yeah.
Nabta Playa has one. Stonehenge. And it looks like a picture of Göbekli Tepe. Looks like they got some small ones too.
Yeah, they built circular rooms, and then in the middle of the room they had these 2 huge T-shaped stones erected. And I still don't think we really have any idea what they were doing. And they carved pictures of animals and stuff on these things, and they put I think they carved fingers on them somewhere, so it's like they represent people holding their hands to their side or something like that. I don't know. They don't know. They don't know what it means. That's before language as we know it.
It's pretty cool. I know Wikipedia is not the most amazing source, but it actually seems to have some pretty good information, some good pictures on a lot of the objects that were there.
At Göbekli Tepe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
I like Wikipedia. A lot of people rip on it.
I like it too. It actually at the bottom you have connections to sources,
Yeah.
which is pretty neat.
I guess if it on political issues, it's real, leftist or whatever.
Right.
But I don't care. That's not what I use it for. Like something like this, Göbekli Tepe. It'll be great, and it'll report like the consensus view within the scientific community. So you'll just be getting the standard view of everything, and that's the way to go, or that's the way for Wikipedia to run things. As long as people know that when they're reading it, and yeah, they show. Oh yeah, yeah. You can see the circular. Wow, that aerial photo is neat. I've never seen that.
Yeah, isn't that pretty neat? I saw that. Pretty cool. Yeah, you're right. It is like these rooms, of some sort.
Yeah, and in the middle they have these two huge T's erected.
Yeah, I see that.
And I guess around the outside ring, there's these T's going around it. But in the middle, they're really big. And it's just crazy looking.
Mm-hmm. It is. They are crazy looking.
Yeah. But that took effort to make. I mean, this really places megalithic building before we thought it was happening at all. And I don't know. It's just a mystery.
Sorry, I know we kind of got pretty sidetracked there. We talked about Göbekli Tepe, some of the older ziggurats, these circular temples, if you will, and I forget why we kind of went on, or you went on that train of
Yeah,
thought.
I know.
That's okay. Just trying to
I
get
was-
you back to where you were. That's all.
I know how it started. I was in the genealogy of Cain in Genesis 4.
Oh, right. There we go.
That goes all the way back there. I don't know how I ended up here.
Well, we got into the flood, and then maybe you got into like some pre-flood cities. Oh, you were talking about how like there might have been something troubling to your theory about like some archaeological evidence or something of that nature, and then got into some pre-flood cities. That's all. I think that might have been.
Yeah, Jericho is undisturbed by the flood. And if you think about it, technically, Jericho is within Eretz Eden. It's on the west of the Jordan. After Joshua crosses the Jordan with the Israelites, they come in to the land and they go to Jericho and conquer it. And it's right by the Jordan. I mean, it's right on the edge there. But so this Jericho, and if you look in the history of Jericho, I mean, that'll be on Wikipedia. Let me look that up. There's an interesting thing about it because Jericho went abandoned right about the time of the flood. And even though it wasn't destroyed by the flood may have had some kind of impact that caused Jericho to be abandoned.
It's interesting looking at your chart number 4 here. You have the Americas inhabited, probably forming some sort of tribes of some sort, 14,000 BC, but then we have what looks like the first occurrence of a legitimate civilization in Göbekli Tepe. So that's interesting. 4,000 years later.
Yeah, people were on Earth a long time before they civilized things the way we have now. agriculture.
Be really interesting to find out why this civilization started to occur. That'd be really interesting to find out why. I suppose, yeah, you could always just say advancement of mankind, but you have, like we've talked about, you have these structures that are being built as well.
Yeah.
They're kind of peculiar.
Man becoming civilized may be why that was the time God finally made an Axis Mundi at first. I don't know. Who really knows? Now, I know what Pete Peters says. He thinks that Adam and the Adenic people brought civilization to the earth. But I don't know. That's putting the Garden of Eden too long ago, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, that's 10,000 years? A 10,000-year-old Garden of Eden? Or you would have to, of course, do the young Earth creationist method and start telescoping genealogies.
I don't know. I think Peters was speaking in a time before we knew about some of this stuff.
That's also true.
That sermon I have from him is probably from the late 70s or early 80s. They wouldn't have known about Göbekli Tepe. They would have known Jericho's really old. I don't know. I forget the name of that lady now that originally did the study at Jericho. Well, anyway, yeah, I was talking a little about the descendants of Cain. Their names seem to be strange little turns on the Sethite names. I could be wrong. Some I say in chart number 1 lane is all the way to the left. I have a little asterisk next to a statement here. I say, remember, true Hebrew names only trace back to the Babel dispersion in 2334 BC, at the very most. At the very most. And that's even probably older than they go. Moses ascribed purposeful names to the earliest patriarchs. The names that Moses is ascribing to men here, and people debate this, but how historical is the name, say, Jared? Was this man named Jared? Or did Moses call him that because it was during his life that the sons of God descended? You see, I think when you look at some of this, you have to realize that Moses is naming people to tell us things, and they're not necessarily the historical name of the man. And, at least up to the Tower of Babel, and I use that as a marking point in my note because we know that I'm letting a car go by. We know that the people, the Adenic people living before then, spoke a language that is lost today. And the sacred text, however, is in Hebrew. And so really any of the names of people from the pre-Babel narrative, Genesis 1 to 11, they are ascribed by Moses for a purpose. That's my take on it. There's people that might disagree. I don't know.
Well, it'd kind of make him a little bit of a genius to kind of give us these clues on what the roles of these particular people were, to give them underlying meanings to their names, where if we had just the original text, we wouldn't have these kind of clues to determine kind of what their roles were.
Yeah, I think that the names of these men can tell us what was going on in Eden. If you're clever enough to put it together. I do not understand the reason for the name Enos for Canaan. I don't know what Canaan means. There, Smith. I don't know. Mahililel, praise of God. I don't know. Jared, descent. I know what that one means. Enoch, dedicated. I know what that one means. Methuselah, they died. It seems that Methuselah's named as he is because when he died, then the flood came. Lamech, again, Noah's father, for humiliation. We know why he was disappointed, or his name, for humiliation, or disappointed, or brought low, because he thought Noah was to be the one to restore things, but Noah preached judgment. I have some of it put together, but not all of it. And then down in Cain's line, see, if Boscawen is correct, and I think he is, I follow his belief that Cain crossed the Jordan, then wandered to the Euphrates and followed it south to Sumer. That's what I would say is the path Cain took when he left Eden. And he ended up down in this area where the Ubaid civilization was occurring, these people, and he settled there and built a city. And that came to be known as Uruk. He named the name of the city Enoch. But because of, how should I put this? He named the city Enoch, but you'll notice in Genesis 10, it's referred to as Erech. And that is because, gosh, how can I phrase this? It has to do with a post-Babel confusion of tongues. The name of Enoch it became Erech according to the Hebrew tongue. They call it Erech. And it's Uruk in the Ubaid language. These are all names for the same place. But that's why in Genesis 10, it's called Erech. It's one of the cities of Nimrod's kingdom. Cain was Edenic, and he left and ended up in ancient Sumer, where he settled. But he had this really longevity, this long lifespan, and his descendants were living long times. And this eventually became captured in the traditions of the ancient kings living a long times in Sumer myth. That's why they have that thinking. And there's people that'll disagree, but I would say that's what Moses is trying to tell you. That's what Moses claims to be as the prophet of Yahweh at this very late point when Moses the prophet lives after all these events. He's the prophet correcting the record, though. And he's pointing out the longevity involved with these ancient people. And he knows about myths of the ancient kings living long times. He knows that. He's giving us the real source of that. This is all really good stuff that is important for the close of chapter 4, man. All this genealogy, I was skipping right by this, really. And it's important stuff. And with the pre-Adamite view, something you can notice, chart 1 lists all these things going on Earth while these things were going on. The city of Enoch founded. Well, the city of Eridu was founded in 3800 BC. And we have the Malta temples being constructed. With the pre-Adamite view, though, you can understand the Edenic history and let all these other historical places and people fall into place, and you just line it all up. The unearthed creationist view has all these ancient sites they can't explain. Hugh Ross's old Earth view has tremendous telescoping and just has things about it that people don't accept. It's like, nah, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it seems like your view, the pre-Adamite view, all these points in history just naturally fall in, and you don't have to move them around, and it's just really nice, really, to spend all this time trying to think of a new, unrealistic idea of around these cities and whatnot, but it just falls right in place. And how nice is that?
Yeah. And the simplest answer is usually the correct one. And this is it.
It comes together so nicely. How can you not, see it this way? But I guess it's just too different enough to be seen from what most people understand nowadays.
Yeah. And something else I'm doing is tying everything into Jerusalem. And that's important. That's really a part of this that makes the whole Bible make sense. All in one, this view ties it together.
Well, you had said that, several years ago, you recognized the significance of the kingdom and everything, but it wasn't until you found this you recognized it went back even further. This centralization around Jerusalem went back as far as the garden.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple interesting things in Genesis, and that is that God takes Enoch.
And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
And where did he take him? He took him in the same place where he took Adam. He took him into the garden.
And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it.
So he took him into the garden. That's the Bible answer anyway.
Now, where was this place? The answer, as Dr. Martin gives it, is actually plain, but it may be a surprise to some people. Enoch was transferred into the Garden of Eden, which, if you remember the story, actually remained on earth up until the flood.
Right.
This was the place where God had his presence. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, and chapter 4, verse 16. This was a place where anyone taken into the garden could talk to God face to face, as the word presence signifies. So that, suddenly, it all kind of comes clear. It all makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It was in the Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, that God was accustomed to walk in the cool of the day, in Genesis 3:8. And now note this point. The Scripture says specifically, with regard to Enoch, that two men were able to, quote, walk with God, end quote. And these two men were Enoch and Noah. Genesis chapter 5, verses 22 to 24, and Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9. While later men, such as Abraham, were able to, quote, walk before God, end quote, Genesis chapter 17, verse 1. But it was only in the midst of the garden that God walked. And to, quote, walk with God, end quote, meant that Enoch was transferred into the garden where he stayed in a permanent way in God's presence until Enoch died.
People argue that, of course. And Cain's Lamech killed him out of jealousy. God chose this Edenic man to restore Eden instead of the Superman that was birthed to his daughter, Naamah, a Nephilim, a special man to restore Eden. So Lamech was upset, and he killed Enoch. People won't accept that, but I'm telling you, that is what Lamech's little poem is all about. And it's funny because Lamech really, he was disappointed. He was disappointed about how his line was not chosen to restore Eden, to restore the Axis Mundi. He was disappointed, and the name Lamech means brought low, brought down, disappointed. And it's funny because we have a Lamech also in Seth's lineage, and it's the father of Noah, but he was disappointed. Let's take a look at that real quick. That's something a lot of people don't know. In Genesis 5:28, it says,
And Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed.
So Lamech thinks Noah is going to restore the Axis Mundi.
And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died.
Now, that's incorrect right there, that he was 777. That is not right. That's incorrect. And that's not the right age. He didn't live to be 777. And I'll get to why that is in just a moment. But Lamech was hoping that his son would restore the Axis Mundi. And he saw something special about Noah when he was born. And that's another theme that I'll have to develop sooner or later. It's kind of like Moses when he was born. His parents saw that he was a goodly child. Well, Lamech must have seen that Noah was a goodly child. And he said, this is the one, But he was disappointed because Noah, having been instructed by God, brought a message of judgment. Noah brought a message of judgment, and his own father didn't believe it and got killed in the flood. And people don't really understand that. But the true age that Lamech lived is preserved actually in the Samaritan Pentateuch. And let me look that up real quick. Well, phooey. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just thinking, although it is the incorrect age, it's kind of funny that Lamech lived 777 years. It's kind of a significant number that they at least gave him, even though it's incorrect.
Yeah, well, it makes me wonder if it was even kind of fudged a bit to be that, because 777, I mean, come on,
Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. It's kind of too much of a coincidence, or a little more than a coincidence. That is a little funny.
On the other hand, I just don't think a priest would do that, like, so I don't know, but it's just, I don't know.
I suppose it's possible, but that's just kind of weird to have such a strange number there. So I don't know if maybe the priest was trying to hide something. I don't know. Not sure.
Well, he could have been just trying to represent the Edenic lineage here as very righteous men all the way through. And that could have been the reason. It could have been as simple as that. I don't know. It could have been a mistake. But in the Samaritan Pentateuch, Genesis 5:30 says, and Lamech lived after he begat Noah 600 years. And in Genesis 7:6, it says, and Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. And so you can tell that Noah's father died the year of the flood. And what does that tell you? It tells you that he didn't believe Noah's pronouncement of judgment, and he died in the flood.
It's funny. He thinks that Noah's there to restore things, and I suppose at the time he could have, I guess, or was supposed to, but just like you said, did not believe Noah that it was going to be through judgment.
Yeah. Seth's Lamech thought that he gave birth to Noah, a goodly child who would restore the Axis Mundi. He was disappointed when Noah came when Noah came preaching judgment, and he didn't believe. And he died in the flood. But that's what Adam apparently did, because he only allowed some access to the tree of life. And then Enoch was in the garden. Lamech went up there and fought him and killed him. But apparently Enoch hurt Lamech. Let me see. Genesis 4.
And Lamech said unto his wives Adah and Zillah,
Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold.
For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. So Lamech was hurt in this. So Enoch got a wound in on him. But Lamech killed him. And that's why he disappears from the narrative altogether. I mean, God took him into the garden, but it's so weird you just hear nothing else.
That is weird. What chapter is that?
Well, that's in chapter 5. It's in the genealogy that's incorporated, this that we'll have to go over. The first part of Genesis 5 I need to go over with people. It's a part of Genesis that people will say is difficult for the pre-Adamite view, just the way it's presented. Genesis 5, 1 to 4, I guess. Like, we'll have to talk about that.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that because I looked at Genesis 5 while we were, I think, talking about Genesis 4, and it actually did seem like what looks like kind of a troubling passage for the pre-Adamite view. I noticed that as well. You kind of have the blending of, I don't know if it's a summary of something, or I don't know what it is in the first 4 verses there, or 3 verses.
Yeah, well, let's see. In verse 1, well, there's a couple things you have to understand with this. First of all, the King James makes it seem more difficult than it is, and really I like the NRSV presentation better, or there's a few others that put it better. So just looking at some other translation helps, but there's a few things to keep in mind here. In verse 1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Now that's the old Toledot division. It's got that word generations. That's what that word is, Toledot. This line itself, the first line in verse 1, should just stand alone, and it's a divider. So that's something to keep in mind. And then something else to keep in mind as you read this, and really as you read all of Genesis, is in reality, there is no use of a proper name Adam in Genesis. Never. The word always just means man. And whenever you see Adam, it's a decision being made by the translators. And there's times when you can tell it's referring to a particular man, and that would be God's man, the Edenic man. But there's times when it means mankind, and so you just have to be careful. And that's true whether you're reading these opening verses in chapter 5 here or anywhere in Genesis. When you see Adam, just know that the translators are choosing to represent it as a proper name, and that might not be the case. So but what you have really here is a Toledot and then a summary that is creating the original mankind. And then in verse 3, it begins tracing the lineage from God's particular people that he began with, the Edenic people. And people try to argue with me on that and saying, no, I don't see that there. And it's like, well, okay, but that's just the way I see it. And maybe reading it in the NRSV or something can help people see it a little better. I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you what, I have the NRSV pulled up here on my computer, and it is very different from the King James, especially
Yeah.
if you notice that 5a is a toledote. It's a separation. It's a standalone piece. It is way different. I mean, they even say when God created humankind, He made them in the likeness of God, made male and female. He created them, and He blessed them and named them humankind when they were created. And then continues on with Adam's genealogy.
Yeah. And that's really the way I look at it. And people could, people can disagree, and there's nothing I can do about it. There's just some, it's just people have to make their own decisions here and stuff. Something else is that in Genesis 5:3, it goes on to say that Adam begat a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth. And this again uses the type of language from chapter 1, but you have to keep in mind that Adam's fallen at this point, and this is saying that this nature's being passed along and stuff. Let's see, how can I phrase that better?
I think I get what you're saying. It's like now that he's no longer perfect, or now that he has the knowledge of good and evil, he's just like all the other mankind. So he was
Yeah.
able to bear someone in his likeness and his image.
Yeah, and it's important to know that this likeness and image that is being passed on here to Seth is a corrupted one, like Paul would use to argue his point in Romans 5, So Adam's failure caused Seth here to be born in a corrupted mortal state, even though Genesis 5:3 doesn't say that. We know that from the apostle later. That's really being captured here in this idea, in his own likeness and after his image. It's not, I can't argue that 100%. I mean, I see it there. I can't force it on anyone, but, that's what I see there. So, I don't know.
I think that the King James version seems like a pretty good, looking at it, I suppose, as it is, without any understanding of the text, you can see like, oh, this is clearly Adam and the mankind. Genesis 1 and 2 were the same account, and I
Yeah.
suppose that's a possibility. But at the same time, I've never really heard anybody really use Genesis 5 for that. Actually, people just kind of assume in Genesis 1 and 2, and then I've actually never really encountered this in verse 5 before until you mentioned it last time.
If I was a young earth creationist, I would go here and use it, I don't know. What was I going to say? Oh, well, when Jesus in the New Testament, he refers back to, he's like, in the beginning, when God made them male and female. I got a car going by. When Jesus in the Gospels refers to the beginning and God making man and woman and stuff, people will think, oh, it's what's he got in mind there? Genesis 1, Genesis 2. I kind of think he has these verses in Genesis 5 in mind. I think that's what he has in mind. So just something to think on. Of course, he probably has them all in mind. He quotes the priest in the two shall be one flesh. I think he quotes that at one point when he's talking about it. So he probably has them all in mind, but I've thought he's had this in mind. So, yeah, a person, a stickler on it, a young earth creationist would tell me that I'm looking at Genesis 5:3. I have like an arbitrary kind of turn I put on it or something. They would say that, and I don't really think I do.
think what's important is it's one of those, I suppose, verses that really could be argued anyway, and doesn't really pose, I guess, a threat, if you will, to either view. But it's not really an obstacle for us, really, looking at it the right way. That is interesting.
Yeah,
That
it's
first part is a toledot, though. I mean, that sets up the rest of the passage to read, or at least the next couple verses to read real different.
Yeah, and there'll be some people maybe that don't believe what I said about Adam, that it's gonna, you can figure that out from looking in a concordance, or Skinner makes a comment about that somewhere, and I'm sure it's Skinner, and I'll put that on the screen, because he mentions that really the proper name Adam isn't ever really used in the Genesis. Oh, I know I came across him talking about that when I was looking at his notes on Eve, because he brought out the fact that we have a name preserved for the woman, but not the man. He was like, isn't that interesting, And as he was talking about that, he happened to mention that. So maybe I'll show that on the screen for people. You could tell from a concordance, though. I suppose something I should look at is the Septuagint, though, as whether they chose to say man or Adam would be important. And I know Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he says the first man, Adam. He actually says man in Greek and then Adam in Greek. And it's probably because he's referring back to the Septuagint, but I imagine if I looked into it, I would find in certain places the Septuagint translators decided to place a name on the man, and if that's the case, then it would just be interesting, I guess, to see which verses they decided to do that in and stuff. I don't know. Something else I wanted to mention, Lane, since we're recording this, is that Lamech, the reason he said, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. The reason he said that is because he killed an Edenic man. Because that's what Cain did. And he's mimicking the protection that was put on him. And so I think it's an indication that his victim or victims were Edenic people. And one of his victims could have been Cain himself, which would especially make sense of why he takes that vengeance and puts his own turn on it for his own benefit, It could be because he killed Cain. I'll just put it out there. It's wild. It's crazy. But people just have to think on it and they'll see that this is true. And what you have here, and there's a couple ways of looking at it, but I'll give the most outrageous version just so people can think on it. What you have here is Lamech, who has 2 wives. He's also committed a double murder, and he's written a poem about it. He's upset because his daughter, Naamah, has had Nephilim offspring with the sons of God, and so have other men. Their daughters have had these offspring, and they're hoping that these will be the ones to restore the garden. And what we'll find in chapter 5, when it gets into the Lamech and Enoch there, is that God selected Enoch to restore things instead of selecting one of these men from Naamah, the girl that's Lamech's daughter. Instead of selecting from his family. So he's disappointed there. If you look into the name Tubal-Cain, you will find some commentators and even some ancient Jewish legend that says it's believed that Cain may have impregnated Lamech's wife with that son. And that's why the son was named Tubal-Cain. And so it's possible that what Lamech did, he was upset. And it's possible he's also disappointed in Cain. And he goes and kills Cain and kills Enoch and writes this poem about it.
I think both make sense. He killed Cain and he builds upon that 70, that builds on with that 7, or he like you said, kills an Edenic man, a man that was able to kind of restore the line, yet killed him anyway. So I think both make sense.
Yeah. The victim when Cain killed Abel, the victim there was a car went by. The victim there was possibly one that could restore things. Abel, his sacrifice was accepted to the Lord. Cain was upset, disturbed about that. Well, the victim here, Lamech's victim, would have been one that could have restored all things. That's Enoch. I found an interesting quote from Rabbi Eliezer that I want to read to you. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer refers to something he's heard and that he seemingly agrees with himself. He says this: Rabbi Simeon said, "The Holy One, blessed be he, pointed out the altar with a finger to Abraham our father and said to him, 'This is the altar.' That was the altar whereon Cain and Abel sacrificed. It was the same altar whereon Noah and his sons sacrificed. As it is said, and Abraham built the altar there. And Abraham built an altar there is not written here, but and Abraham built the altar there. That was the altar whereon the first ones of old had sacrificed." How about that? So there's an ancient Jewish tradition that says the altar where Cain and Abel sacrificed is the same place where Noah built his altar or sacrificed, and it's the same place where Abraham built his altar. Just like I said. So maybe Rabbi Eliezer ain't so crazy after all.
It's in these crazy ideas you actually find some pretty legitimate. First, you think, how crazy could this idea be? And then you start to see how maybe it can actually fit. And what do you know? So even though maybe this rabbi gets some things wrong, I'm sure there's some things that he does get right.
Well, I did know for a long time that Jewish tradition thinks the Garden of Eden was right there where the Temple Mount is. That's I knew about that. I just stumbled upon this from Rabbi Eliezer, though. He connects the altars together. I was like, holy cow. I mean, that's a great comment. I wish I had this when I made my video, Altars of Eden. I would have shown this, been like, cool. But I knew from Rabbi Yehuda Glick that the Temple Mount's where the Garden of Eden was. That's in a video on the channel. Let me see. There were two. I took a clip from a Jimmy DeYoung movie, and oh yeah, Rabbi Chaim Richman, and Rabbi Yehuda Glick. You know, maybe it was Jimmy DeYoung that said the Garden of Eden was in Jerusalem, and back then I was like, nah, that's not right, you know. But since then, I know who caused me to see it, though. Ernest Martin. Dr. Martin's the one that caused me to see it, so. But Jimmy had it right way back before I realized it.
Did you struggle to believe just because you didn't really have a whole lot of evidence behind it, or you didn't see the connection, or just...
I was probably reading that verse on the four rivers the way everyone else does, and they're like, aha, here's how we can find it. But of course, rivers don't split ever. You never find a river splitting and becoming two rivers. But for some reason, I spent years thinking it had to do with rivers splitting. Like, I don't know. I thought it must be up in Armenia, even though there's no one source for these few rivers up there. And I guess down in Sumer, you think that four rivers all converge into one mighty stream, but that's not how the passage reads. But I guess I just believed it was in Armenia, and
I suppose like what most people do.
Yeah. Well, you know, a guy that I just really like, and I still like, I like a lot of what he says. This guy, Arthur Custance, wrote articles on old Earth and regional deluge and stuff like that. And he thought it was in Armenia. There's an old map that shows there's an old map I have that shows a depiction of the Garden of Eden in Armenia. It shows Armenia, and it says Eden, and it's funny. I can't find it. I have to try to find that, and it's probably on the internet. Put that in the video. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I just assumed. Arthur Custance thought it was in Armenia. You know, I knew Arthur Custance is the one that really emphasized in his writings. He was like, you know, Eretz, the land of Eden is what it means. Kind of like the land of Nod and stuff. He's the one that really brought my attention to that. And and he thought Mount Ararat meant Mount Ararat. So with a small footprint of a flood and the ark landing on Mount Ararat, that's another reason to place it in Armenia. Oh, and the reason my footprint could be as small as the region occupied by the Jebusites is because Mount Ararat doesn't mean Mount Ararat.
I mean, I'll tell you what, man, there's a lot of things that'd blow people away, but I think fully explain that would really blow some people away.
Yeah, when we get to that, I'll go through it in detail. It's real simple. It's real simple, and it's real important. That's the biggest game changer right there, man. I already told you that one time when it's so funny to set people up for a regional deluge in Canaan, you know, because everyone knows the ark landed on Mount Ararat. So
I'll tell you what, man. The school that I work at hasn't asked me yet, but usually they ask their teachers to preach at one of the chapels, and I'll tell you what, I got a lot of topics I could talk about, but I got to think of the most appropriate one that I could break to an entire an entire young Earth covenantal theologist school. But I don't know.
Tell them that the Garden of Eden was in Jerusalem, and you could preach on God calling Abraham into Canaan, and you could start in Genesis 12 and just go through it. And you could say, now, why did God call Abraham into Canaan? Well, because that's where everything you've just been reading in the first 11 chapters happened. Just close your Bible and walk away from the pulpit. They'll all be dumbstruck, man.
Close my Bible, drop the mic, walk off the stage. Actually, I've thought about stuff like that where I would never go there's certain things I just wouldn't preach despite me believing them just because of trying to keep a job and understand the audience. But I think there are some things that definitely could be talked about. For instance, the garden being located in Jerusalem, and maybe the ark landing on, what was it, Mount Moriah?
Mount Zion.
Mount Zion, yeah. And just some other cool things too. Cain and Abel were twins, and I think at the literal serpent might be a bit much.
Oh yeah, that's
the literal serpent, the origin of evil, not being Satan. That's a bit too much. The sons of God is always a pretty cool one. Recognizing the sons of God and the divine council. That one's pretty cool.
Tell them it must have been angels because Jared descent. It's got to be referring to that. And the sons of Cain don't descend down. It's angels that descend down.
There you go. Heck yeah.
But there are people out there who are not stupid. And that's who this show is for.